Yeah. All right, so good afternoon. Thank you once again for joining us for this webinar. We're really happy to return to you. This is the third installment in the State of the Environment series. And so we think it's a very timely one with all the conversation, not just about how hot we've been feeling, but how that is impacting every ecosystem around us as well. And so we're happy to have the very esteemed presenters we have today to share so much more on this topic. But before we go any further, I am representing the Cari-Bois Foundation. Of course, this initiative is one of the Cari-Bois Environmental News Network, and we have with us the coordinator and editor of that platform, which is part of what we do here at the Cari-Bois Foundation. We have with us Tyrell Gittens, so I'll just ask him to give some introductory remarks to the webinar before we get going. Tyrell? Tyrell, you're muted.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
All right, great. I'm not muted anymore. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tyrell Gittens, and I'm the project coordinator and editor of the Cari-Bois Environmental News Network, as my colleague Ardeen would have mentioned. We are so very happy that you would have taken the time this afternoon to join us at our third State of the Environment webinar. In April, we would have launched two webinar series. This one titled the State of the Environment series, as well as the Climate Breakdown series, as we aim to raise awareness for different environmental issues inclusive of climate change. So at these webinars, we tend to hone in on a specific topic related either to climate change or the general environment, and have experts from around the Caribbean not only share more information about these issues, but facilitate discussions about how we can create solutions and work together to create a cleaner, greener Caribbean. So I don't want to take out too much time. Sorry, I don't want to take away from too much time from our dynamic presenters this afternoon. So I'll throw it back to my colleague Ardeen. And once again, thank you for being here with us this afternoon.
You are muted. Somehow we still managed to forget to unmute ourselves after doing this for years. Okay, great. So I am very happy now to be able to introduce our esteemed presenters. As I mentioned earlier, I'm just struggling now to find the bios that I know that I have somewhere. Tyrell, are you in a position to pull them up, please? I don't know what's going on with my computer.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, I think I found it. Yeah, okay, I'm good. Tyrell? I'm gonna go ahead, okay? All right, so first up, we have our Trinidad and Tobago representative, Dr. Anjani Ganesh. She's a coral reef ecologist, and for her PhD, Anjani worked on a global coral reef mapping project called the XL Catlin Seaview Survey. She spent 4 years on survey expeditions to the Great Barrier Reef, Coral Sea, Hawaii, and the Caribbean, collecting imagery for the Global Reef Record. And use the imagery to identify prevailing patterns of present-day reef composition through the wider Caribbean. Anjani currently works at the Institute of Marine Affairs right here in Trinidad and Tobago, and her work focuses on observing coral reef health and understanding the drivers of change. Her research seeks to identify strategies for building coral reef health and resilience in Tobago through marine conservation management and applying restoration. So Anjani, we'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Ardeen. Thanks for everybody for joining today, and thank you for Cari-Bois for inviting me to present on some of the work we do in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, mostly for me in Tobago, even though we're based in Trinidad. So I'm going to share my screen. A second. All right, so thumbs up if you can see the screen. Great, thanks. Right, so we're going to focus on coral bleaching and the impacts to the reefs of Trinidad and Tobago. As Ardeen mentioned, I work for the IMA, the Institute of Marine Affairs, and not the EMA, which is the Environmental Management Authority. So for those who are less familiar, we are a government-funded body for marine research. So we have several long-term monitoring programs that focus on monitoring the health of several marine ecosystems, coral reefs being the one that I'm focused on. But we also try and do a lot of research as it is applied to Tobago's marine ecosystems and whatnot. And then a lot of that research is packaged to advise on things like sustainable management practices, policies, even legislation. And then we have a component where we do focus on a lot of marine education. We have our own information center and marine education center where the researchers are also involved in going to schools and giving lectures and whatnot. So it is a very it's not just pure research, but it is a lot of applied research. So just taking you back to the coral basics, because I know we're speaking to a wide array of people, and even though I've been studying reefs for a long time, corals are not well known in terms of what they actually are. So in terms of a coral, I like to refer to corals as they are animals and they are related to jellyfish, but there are very key differences in terms of their biology. So if you look at the image, the diagram on the left, you can see that the corals, like jellyfish, have tentacles, there's a mouth, there's a stomach. But where jellyfish tend to grow up and they live in the water column, they drift and they catch prey. Corals, when they're born, especially reef-building corals, they settle in one spot and they grow in that spot for the rest of their lives. So the diagram on the left shows an individual coral polyp, and these polyps grow and multiply into coral colonies, is what you see on the right-hand side. So you can see each coral polyp as part of the colony with their tentacles and their little tiny mouths. So other key differences is that reef-building corals build reefs, right? And they do that because they grow a skeleton, a rocky skeleton made of aragonite or a calcium carbonate skeleton. And so if you look at the base here, you see that when the corals grow, they lay down a base of that rocky skeleton, and that provides a reef structure. So you have a coral individual that grows into a colony, right? And then you have several coral colonies growing in an area of environment which is conducive to their survival, and that's how you create a reef. The other very interesting thing about corals is that they have a very special relationship with a microalgae called zooxanthellae. And that zooxanthellae is what gives the corals their bright and brilliant colors that you see on Caribbean reefs and reefs around the world, right? Without that, they would actually resemble closer to jellyfish, which are more translucent in appearance, right? So the algae that lives in the coral tissue, it's a symbiosis where the algae provides food because the algae can photosynthesize, draw energy from the sunlight, and they could share that food with the coral host. The coral host in turn provides a safe space for the algae to live and grow in. It's like a hotel, so the coral host will remove its waste and then provide it with essential nutrients or minerals in order for the algae to do its job, right? So now, when it comes to coral bleaching, that's when the relationship, that very efficient relationship, which allows the formation of reefs around the world in very low nutrient environments, in remote places, that relationship between the algae and the coral is a very efficient one and allows to create large reef colonies and reef structures. When that relationship breaks down, you get a phenomenon as coral bleaching, right? So essentially, a coral host, the environmental conditions change so that it's not optimum, and so the host is not working at optimum levels. And so that relationship becomes strained between the algae that lives in the tissues and the coral host. And eventually the algae would leave the coral host and the coral turns white. And so it's no longer those brilliant colors. And eventually you have that bleaching phenomenon that happens. So coral bleaching can happen for a number of reasons. It can happen at different scales. So you can have part of a colony that's bleaching because you have certain polyps that are being stressed out and maybe being attacked by another coral. Or you could have coral bleaching that occurs at massive scales, or known as mass coral bleaching events, right? So there are a number of causes of coral bleaching. The more prominent ones these days are the rising ocean temperatures, so extremely high temperatures, which are beyond the thermal tolerance of corals, is what you see in a lot of in tropical areas around the world. And that is related to events such as El Nino, that's piled on to climate change. You can get coral bleaching from runoff and pollution events. So if you imagine when you have a lot of sediment in the water column, or you have eutrophication in the water, or you have algal blooms, the algae cannot get the sunlight it needs, and so it will also leave the corals under those stressful conditions, or even exposure during low tides in very shallow environments. So there are a number of stressful situations where you can get coral bleaching. With respect to Tobago, where most of our reefs occur, the IMA has been conducting coral reef research since the 1980s, but it was only until 2010 we had a monitoring program that was consistently done at targeted sites around Tobago. So in 2010, we started off with 4 sites, and today we've been monitoring annually between 2010, and we actually just came back from a field trip this year. We currently now have 10 long-term monitoring sites around Tobago. So what are we monitoring for? We tend to monitor for reef health, and one of the biggest indicators of reef health is the percentage cover of hard corals, or the reef-building corals, right? Obviously, if you want thriving reefs, you need the corals that create the reefs to also thrive, right? So if you look at the graph on the right, this is the y-axis, which is the mean coral cover, and you're just focusing on the solid green line, which is the hard coral cover percentage cover. We actually started monitoring just before a major bleaching event that happened in 2010 around the Caribbean. And what you notice is that the coral cover, which averaged around 30%, dropped to about 15%. So we essentially lost half of our coral cover after that one bleaching event. And then in the years after, the coral cover basically, on average, fluctuates between 14 and 16% to this day. So there are a couple of things here, right? First thing is that where hard coral cover was a dominant contributor to the reef, now turf algae is the most dominant, which is that yellow line, and it has consistently remained the most dominant component of the reef. The other thing that's interesting is that we're looking for reef recovery. So most of the reefs around Tobago are dominated in brain corals, which are very slow-growing, stress-tolerant corals that create very dense skeletons. So we expect recovery to be very slow. But what we do see is that there's very minimal, even in the last 10 years, with some exceptions of a couple sites, you don't see an overall recovery process. Now, if I were to backtrack or hindcast this data, if you go back to 2005 or even before, a lot of our coral reef covers during the 80s and 90s would be around 50 to 60%. So even in 2010, a lot of our reefs were already significantly degraded by previous disturbance events. So now we're looking into the future of what the risk of bleaching is for the reefs of Tobago. For this, we definitely rely on global and regional models to give us insights to what coral bleaching will look like in the future. And also we rely on things like the IPCC reports and the research that informs on climate change studies. That is essentially what we rely on to get that kind of information for the future. So the IPCC special report for 1.5 degrees states that with 1.5 degree global warming, we expect a further loss of 70 to 90% of our reef-building corals. And then a 2 degrees rise would probably result in 99% of our reefs, of our corals being lost. So these are some dire projections as it relates to global warming. Currently, we are at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial, and it is very likely that we will exceed the 1.5 by mid-century. Right? With respect to Tobago, we used a downscale projection that was created by Van Hooydonk, and they created it for the IPCC models. And this is for the worst case carbon emissions scenario, which is RCP 8.5. And essentially, it is a model for bleaching risk. And what it says on the map is that the yellow areas basically highlight that it is likely that by 2040 to 2050, we're going to get annual severe bleaching events. So you're going to get severe bleaching on an annual basis at most of our sites, with the exception of a few of our reef areas, which is the areas in green, which are likely to experience ASB in the decade after. The dots, the colors of the different sites show our ecological assessments of those reefs. So we assess for resilience, and we use the basically resilience scores along with the risk scores, which is the bleaching risk, to determine vulnerability. So what we find is that Flying Reef has the highest vulnerability to coral bleaching, given that it's already very degraded. It has a very poor resilience score, whereas Booby Island in north, which is in Charlottesville in northeast Tobago, has a relatively higher resilience score and a lower risk, a relatively lower risk, and therefore would have relatively lower vulnerability. But if you use other RCP pathways, so if you use RCP 4.5, what you do find is that the risk of annual severe bleaching gets delayed by 20 years. So instead of 2050, it will be around 2070. But that will essentially give us more time to develop adaptive management practices or restoration strategies to help our reefs along into the future. So we rely heavily on, in the terms of bleaching alerts and bringing awareness to potential bleaching on our reefs, we rely heavily on NOAA's Coral Reef Watch, and we use the 5-kilometer virtual station. So there's a virtual station that's focused on Trinidad and Tobago, and basically the alerts are as follows. So you get a composite map, which is generated using remotely sent sea surface temperatures and projected for a maximum of 3 months in advance. So you have the 3 windows: so current, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months in the future. And then there are 4 levels of alerts that we that there are depending on the location on the map. So this is an example from 2022 in October. If I showed you this year, you won't be able to see the different colors because it's just all dark red. But you have 4 levels of alerts. You have bleaching watch, which is essentially like a low-level heat stress. Bleaching warning, meaning that there's enough heat stress that would probably result in bleaching if it persists. And then bleaching alert level 1, meaning that significant bleaching is likely across species and across extended areas. And then you have bleaching alert level 2, which means that widespread bleaching and coral mortality is likely. What I didn't mention is that if coral bleaches, it doesn't necessarily die, but if it's prolonged, the bleaching is prolonged, the corals lose their major source of food and they would eventually die, right? Or they become vulnerable to things like diseases, which would then result in coral mortality. So bleaching alert level 2 means that it's quite likely that the waters are hot enough for extended bleaching and extended negative impact that will result in coral mortality. So this is just a graph which shows you the changes in sea surface temperatures for Trinidad and Tobago since the 1980s up to today. So if you look at the jagged blue line, that's the measured sea surface temperatures, and that solid blue line, the light blue line, is the thermal threshold temperature, which is around 29 degrees for our corals. So you see, as in the 1990s, there's very low bleaching threats until you get to 1998, which is that was the first global bleaching event that happened. Fast forward, we're seeing more bleaching alerts happening, and in 2005, it's the first time we recorded severe bleaching on our reefs. where we had about 66% bleaching. And then 2010 is when we started our monitoring, where we lost 50% of our coral cover. As you continue to move into the early 2010s, 2020, you see that bleaching alerts become more and more frequent, right? And when I joined the IME, which was in 2019, when we monitor, we recorded low-level bleaching consistently on our reefs over the last 3 years. And now we are at present at 2023 here, where the 2023 trajectory is very similar to that of 2010. So we do expect a lot of bleaching and a lot of coral mortality as a result. In fact, our bleaching alerts started 2 months earlier than the previous years, where we would get bleaching watch alerts in August. This year we got them in June. So all very concerning scenarios. So this is what it looks like today. So currently, this is we are bleaching alert level 2, and the temperatures are likely to persist that way at least for a month, if not more, right? This is related to the combination of global warming on top of El Nino conditions, which are generally more drier, warmer conditions compared to the La Nina situation which we had the last 3 years, where we had wetter and cooler conditions for Trinidad and Tobago. But even with that, because of climate change, the cooler conditions, the La Nina, we still saw very low levels of bleaching every year. So IME has a coral bleaching response plan, and we are responsible for maybe the first four to five steps. So once we get the alerts from NOAA, we do a call to the community, to our stakeholders via our mailing list, WhatsApp, social media. We encourage people to report, those who work in the marine environment, to report to us, either through emails directly or through our See It app, which is our environmental monitoring, citizens reporting app. Once there's enough reporting of bleaching, we will go out, and we will go out in October this year to assess the extent of bleaching and disease outbreaks. And we will compile information to advise on what type of management we should be carrying out. And then we will also be working on looking for, as part of our long-term monitoring, looking at the level of recovery. This part here is a very weak link, because adaptive management requires partnership and collaborations with government officials and bodies, which is a struggle with respect to marine management and coral reef conservation. So what have we seen over the last couple of months? So we were out in August for our annual coral reef monitoring, and even though the waters were very warm, it was on the surface of between 32 to 34 degrees right on the surface. We did do vertical profiles of temperatures, and on the reefs, the temperatures averaged between 30 and 31 degrees. There were a few sites that were still around 29. And we did see a low level amount of peeling and bleaching, but it was still in very low percentages, so less than 5%. We again went out last month, but we were focusing on coral spawning monitoring, which is nighttime diving at one site. And then we actually did see peeling of a lot of our brain corals and bleaching of some of our corals of different species, right? So it is getting progressively worse, but but as long as we were in the field, we did not see widespread bleaching. We reached out to a lot of stakeholders, and now there's more widespread bleaching is being reported. So we're seeing observations in Mac Reef in Trinidad, south side of Southwest Tobago, so like Flying Reef, Sylvan area, Store Bay, Coral Gardens, which is a popular destination for the glass bottom boat tours. So some of the tour operators have been said that they've seen some minor bleaching. However, in sites in Northeast Tobago, like Charlottesville, we have the NGOs up there that said that they haven't seen any bleaching yet, but they would continue to monitor. And we do go out in a few weeks to assess, right? In terms of our actions, the IME is working on this, which has been a bit of a gap, because we're so used to monitoring the research that you know, in terms of management and restoration, we're now looking to sort of working on projects to improve or build capacity to do resilience-based management as it relates to climate change, and even to trial and start restoration strategies, which is occurring in other places in the Caribbean. So it is a priority for us at the IMA to be able to do more active measures for assisting in recovery, but we still need things like fisheries management, which does not exist in Trinidad and Tobago. And we need management of land-based sources of pollution. So we've had the integrated coastal zone policy passed only 2 months ago, and we have a 10-year plan for implementation to improve that. But a lot needs to be done in very little time, considering the projections for the future. So just to finish there, if you want more information, IMA has compiled a dashboard for coral bleaching alert. It compiles information essentially from NOAA, but it focuses on Trinidad and Tobago, and it's a little bit simpler to navigate. If you want more updates on coral bleaching alerts or just updates on the activities and events that IMA is hosting, you can join our mailing list. So you have the 2 QR codes there if you want, and I can share it out. But that's pretty much it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjani, for that. I mean, I want to say you've outlined for us what appears to be a very dire situation, and hopefully there isn't too much despair in the room. But I'm sure when we get to the question and answer part of the meeting, we can get things clarified, and maybe you can drill deeper into some of those restorative and adaptive measures that are being undertaken, and of course, the role of average citizens in this process. So we want to move now to our second presenter, and welcome to those who may just be joining us. We're happy that you can spend some time with us on what may be the lunch hour for some of you. So our next presenter actually comes from Colombia, but she's based in the Bahamas at the moment, and her name is Dr. Valeria Pizarro. She began studying corals and their population dynamics as part of her master's in 1999. She continued to study coral reefs while designing and implementing the Seaflower Marine Protected Area System. After earning her PhD, Valeria became a professor at a university in Colombia, where she continued to study reefs for 8 years. Coral restoration became part of her work in 2007, and she has since worked on Caribbean and Colombian Pacific reefs. In 2020, she joined the Perry Institute for Marine Science in the Bahamas as the manager of their coral program, where most of her current effort is focused on the stony coral tissue loss disease. So Dr. Pizarro, Valeria, I'm a little less formal than that. Welcome, and I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you to the Copper Foundation for the invitation. And now I'm going to ask Brandon if he can share the screen. He's going to be the one controlling, just in case that my slide, like my presentation, my Wi-Fi fails. So Brandon, can you put it in the full screen so we have one slide per? So yeah, thank you again for the invitation. My name is Valeria Pizarro. I am the Coral Program Manager for the Perry Institute of Marine Science, or as we call it, PIMS. I am based in the Bahamas, and when I have the presentation, if you have issues, Brandon, let me know, and I can share my screen if it's okay.
Brandon? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I'm sharing now. It's a PDF, so it's trying to fix that.
Okay, yeah, you can leave it there. So thank you again for everyone that is here. I hope that you hear me okay. If not, please let me know. So I'm going to talk to you about, of course, coral bleaching, that it's one of the crises that we're suffering, but I'm going to talk to you about, as well as about the Skittle D, or stony coral tissue loss disease. So PIMS is a NGO that uses science-based information to manage and conserve coastal marine ecosystems, working along not only with local communities, as well as public institutions and other partners like NGOs. Next. We have 4 main programs where all our projects are in place. The one that I manage is actually, well, coral reefs. We work as well on fisheries, other on coastal habitats that works on mangrove, seagrass beds, soft bottoms, and other coastal ecosystems, pelagic ecosystems that are not between coral reefs and fisheries. And of course, we work along with the community with environmental education. Next. Our organization have been working for over 50 years in the Caribbean, mostly in the Bahamas, but in the last decade, we have been starting to grow and have projects and collaborated with other NGOs around the Caribbean, as you can see in this map. Next. So I have to say that many of the slides and the things that Anjani said are going to help me on this. So coral reefs are one of our main ecosystems, coastal marine ecosystems in the Caribbean. And of course, their importance rely on what these ecosystems provide to millions of organisms, and more importantly, to us humans and the communities that live from them. These are known as ecosystem services, and coral reefs can do it within these ecosystem services. We can find like protection of coastlines from storms and erosion. They provide jobs for local communities and offer opportunities for recreation. They are also a source of food and new medicines. And we know that over 500 million people depend on reefs for food, income, and protection. And anytime that you're fishing, diving, or snorkeling on and near reefs, that adds hundreds of millions of dollars to local businesses. The net economic value of the world's coral reefs is estimated to be nearly 10 billion of US dollars per year. And we call, when we work in coral reefs, that coral reefs are as known as tropical rainforests of the sea. Next. And as Njani said, these ecosystems are built primarily by stony corals. Next. And these stony corals are animals, and that is very important. So, and then you mentioned that they had a very important symbiosis with the algae that is known as zooxanthellae. This is the main symbiosis that they have, corals and algae, because the algae will provide about 96% of the energy and food that the coral need to survive, which is very important and explains most of the primary productivity that coral reefs have produced on coral reefs. So besides that very important symbiosis, actually the corals, they are in symbiotic relationships with a variety of microorganisms that include bacteria and viruses. The amount of bacteria, viruses, and the diversity of it just allows the corals to function as we know, as a coral holobiont. So it's just like with us, with all our system, that we have bacteria in our gut. So it's the same with them. With any change in the environment or in the typical conditions of the coral reefs, what that happens is that this balance that usually the coral has with the microorganisms can just shift the health of the coral and can play a critical role on the coral adaptation to rapid environmental changes, as well as it can produce or result in coral disease outbreaks and, of course, coral bleaching. Next. So, as most of you might know, global changes, some of those were mentioned by Anjani, are affecting our climate and marine environment. And of course, coral reefs are being affected by many threats that include severe storms and hurricanes, sea level rise, ocean acidification, increased pollution, and of course, increased seawater temperatures. And again, like any potential consequence of or changes in the environment as a consequence of all these threats, what happens is that can result on coral diseases and bleaching events. But what are the differences between coral diseases and bleaching events? Next. So a coral disease is often visible as a change in tissue color and a skeletal structure. As Anjani said, like the coral has the calcium carbonate exoskeleton, and that is what builds actually coral reefs. When you have these changes, either in color or the skeletal tissue and a skeletal structure, that may cause tissue loss that we usually know as tissue mortality, partial mortality, or total mortality, that will be the death of the coral. The origin of coral diseases, which can be viral or bacteria or the combination of both, is very difficult to determine and is not clearly understood by scientists yet. So viruses, bacteria, and any other microorganisms or even changes in the environmental conditions can contribute to coral diseases. Many of these microbes that cause coral diseases are naturally found in nature, in corals and the ecosystems. So it's a combination of factors that disrupt the natural levels of these microorganisms that encourage coral disease to appear. Next. On the other hand, coral bleaching, as Anjani said, it's a stress reaction of the coral animals that happen when they expel the symbiotic algae or zooxanthellae, which is the main food and energy source. One thing that is very important to understand is coral bleaching doesn't mean that the coral is dead. When the coral is bleached, it's alive, it's struggling, and is more susceptible to get disease, to get predated, or to have some kind of mortality, either partial or total. If these stressful conditions, that can be higher temperatures, subside soon enough, the corals can survive the event, they will retake their zooxanthellae, and they will continue to grow and grow coral reefs. However, if the stresses are severe or persist, bleaching can lead to coral death. So coral diseases can result in coral mortality. Coral bleaching doesn't mean that the corals are going to die. Next. So now going to the Bahamas. The Bahamas is an island country as Trinidad and Tobago, located on the northeast of the Great Caribbean or northwest of the Atlantic, whatever you prefer. It consists of more than 700 of islands and keys, and all of them are surrounded by coral reefs. It has high marine biodiversity, and coral reefs have been valuing up to 1.35 million per square kilometer per year. As almost all Caribbean corals, Bahamian reefs are under threat, being climate change and disease outbreaks the main ones. Next. So until the end of 2019, Bahamian coral reefs were in relative good condition, as you can see in this figure, especially compared to many other Caribbean coral reefs. What we have here, it's after monitoring all the different aspects, not only coral cover, but as well like fish abundance, etc. We just have this reef health index, and as you can see, all the green ones indicate that the reef is in fair condition, which was always good. And this was especially in the islands that are more inhabited, that are the ones located on the southeast of the Bahamas. Next. Sadly, that year that we published that, we did another assessment, and we found from some of our partners that at the end of 2019, a deadly disease known as stony coral tissue loss disease, or SCTLD for short, was affecting the Bahamas. And this is a deadly disease because it affects more than half of the reef building corals, and it spreads very quickly, killing hundreds of corals in a matter of weeks. And I'm really happy to learn, or at least that I know, that you don't have that yet in Trinidad and Tobago. Next. So we have been doing assessments, treatments, studies in the Bahamas since 2019, just focusing on this disease. And it has spread, as you can see here, this is the map of the Bahamas, and in red is all the reef areas that so far have been affected that we know, and we have confirmed the presence of the disease since 2019 until now. It covers about 60% of the Bahamas coral reefs. Next. This slide is just showing you the images of the effect of stony coral tertiary loss disease in some of the coral reefs that we have. So we have the same photos on the top of the slide and of the same images on, these are photo mosaics on the bottom of the slide. What we have on the left of the screen are the photos, the top one taken in March 2020, the bottom one taken in April 2021. And what you can see there are how the coral community has changed since as the result of the disease. So we have the same photos on your right, but the difference in there is in red, they are outlined the living brain coral colonies that we had at that time. So if you see from March 2020 to April 2021, a reduction of these outlined corals, and we have estimated, and it's more than 90% of the coral colonies died. And this is in a shallow reef. This is about 5 meters reef in Grand Bahama in a park called Lucayan National Park. Next. So we have been doing a lot of assessments, trying to see how is the disease actually affecting the Bahamas reefs. As I said, it affects more than half of the species that build reefs in the Bahamas and the Caribbean. We have almost the same species, different assemblages in the communities, but are the same. And from our data, we know that we have lost in many places more than 75% of the corals that we had. And we have done other kind of monitoring. One is called AGRA, and we know from that that the Bahamas has an average of 4 colonies per square meters. So when we start calculating, knowing the area of the reefs that we have in the Bahamas, how many corals we have before the Skittle appeared, and we have a number that it was approximately on the order of 22,000 million coral colonies. From the 2019 until June or July 2023, we have estimated that we have lost around 10,000 million corals. And this number is huge, right? But I've been in different talks, and 2 weeks ago, I was in this talk from Dr. Stephanie Shopmeyer from NOAA, and she was presenting the results of how many corals they have lost due to stony coral tissue loss disease, and they just had the right number for a very small part of the Florida Reef Tract. And they have calculated that in the north, they have lost up to more than 44 million colonies from 9 species. But they think, and right now they're calculating how many they have lost in the Florida Tract, and they think that it's going to be in the order of 1 trillion coral colonies. Next. So just because the news were great, now we are experiencing extremely high temperatures, not only in the sea, but as well in land. This is affecting many organisms and ecosystems, including, of course, coral reefs. These high sea temperatures are known as marine sea heat waves, which are actually defined as any time that the oceans are warmer than 90% of the previous observation for a given year. And they can last weeks, months, years. And in this figure in particular, and it's really good that, and then it just show you the the maps that we use to see how high is the risk for coral bleaching. But here, what you have here in that thick black line is how high this year seawater temperature has been, the surface of the seawater has been compared to all the other years. Like last year was a little high, it's the yellow one, but as you can see, all the other ones are below that one. We don't really fully understand all the factors that are causing these year heat waves. We know that the El Niño is playing an important role as a driver, but there are much more on this, and scientists are trying to figure out. Next. So what we're having in the Bahamas is we have a stony coral tissue loss disease, but sadly now we have a massive bleaching event. And this is, again, photomosaics from a reef area in New Providence. And the image on your left, it was taken in January this year, and the image on your right was taken in August this year. As you can see, when you go and you don't know much about corals, you see the one in January, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see something, but it's kind of a dull, right? And then you go into the August one, and you can see all the white, bright corals. And there are some that maybe you don't see that well, but they are like more like bright green. So the bright one are bleach, and the others are pale. And this is something that we are seeing in most of the reefs around the Bahamas. Next. So bleaching is not new for the Bahamas, and then I was saying for Trinidad and Tobago. So we had many researchers working and collaborating with us. And the first bleaching event that was actually recorded was in 1983. So here what you have on your right is all the dates and all the months and years that the Bahamas has experienced any degree of bleaching, from very mild to very massive. All the ones that are underlined are massive bleaching events that resulted, at least from August 1998 and September 2015, on massive mortalities. And here we're having the same issue as in Trinidad and Tobago. This year, bleaching actually started in July, that it's so early compared to any other bleaching record that we have. Next. So just to show you, I'm not going to go really into many of the species, but again, we knew from the NOAA bleaching alert maps that we were going to have some bleaching on the reefs. So in mid-July, I was working around New Providence and Rose Island. There are the islands that I'm based, and the temperatures, the sea water temperatures were 32 degrees Celsius down to 15 meters depth, which is very high for the usual. And I started to see some corals having some bleaching, mainly like staghorn, elkhorn, fire corals, finger corals. And this was affecting about like 20% of all the species in a reef. Next. So by the end of July, beginning of August, this becomes a massive bleaching. So any massive bleaching event is when you have more than 40% of all the coral species bleach. And as you can see in the list, there were many of the corals, including a zoanthid, the one that is like Palithoa caribeum. All the colonies of that zoanthid were bleached. And we're starting to see in shallow reefs some corals like elkhorn corals, fire corals, most are hill corals experiencing some kind of mortality, either partial or total. Next. And the episode of September, and actually last Saturday, bleaching is still happening. We have now, like, temperatures have been going down, but they're still very hot. 30%, and the number of accumulating weeks with these higher temperatures is just, we have in some areas with more than 14 weeks of this heat stress. So we are seeing still, as you can see in the photo, like 80 to 90% of all species are bleached, and is more expensive, more extensive mortality. And in some places like Abaco, there is more north and more to the east. In some areas in Abaco, bleaching isn't as bad as in the central Bahamas, but it's still massive bleaching events. And with still more data, I'm going to be traveling to the south to see how it is over there in the next few weeks. Next. So the potential implications of these massive bleaching events that hopefully is not going to be, but probably it's going to be a little, we're going to experience high mortality rates across a wide range of species, especially elkhorn, staghorn, we know fire corals. The problem with having these high seawater temperatures is that many of the diseases just kind of outbreak, and we have then a combination with bleaching and diseases as black band disease. And of course, the losing or the coral mortality is going to be an interaction between bleaching and Skittle D. This is going and can result in major changes in the coral community, the species composition, but the main problem is the consequences that it will have in ecological function of the reefs, and of course, the ecosystem services that they provide to other animals and to us. This is not going to be that like the corals will die and tomorrow we'll see all those changes. That will take years, but the consequences can be a disaster. Next. But even with those, I'm sorry, I've been a little not very positive. There are reasons for hope. And these are some photos of the same corals from the bleaching event in 2005. And we have many other examples. Some corals can get bleached or partially bleached, as in these colonies, but they can survive and be resilient and get the zooxanthellae back and thrive again in the reef. Next. One of my colleagues in Eleuthera, she went out during the spawning nights, and all the star corals were bleached, as you can see in the photo, but there was a massive spawning night, which is good news. It's like, yeah, corals are struggling, but at the same time, there is reasons for hope, and maybe some of those babies will survive and we have more resistant corals to coral bleaching. Next. And this is the kind of things that we are looking for, trying to identify which are the corals, the species, the genotypes that are actually going to survive. So two colonies from the same species. The one on the right is completely bleached. The one on the left is looking some better. So hopefully it will give you more information. Next. And of course, all this, and it's the same as Njani was saying, like we just have to sample, identify resilient and resistant corals, have more data, do more studies, experiments, and apply these into solutions. And we have to have reefs and we have to restore. And next, and just to finalize, and this is again, we need to reduce other stressors. We need to try to maintain all the natural ecosystem mechanisms. We need to do more research. We need to do restore and rehabilitate reefs. And we need to do our best to call for action from our governments to stop climate change on a global scale. Next. And thank you. And I'm sorry if I talked too long and too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. That was also very useful and insightful information there. I don't think anybody is unhappy with the quality of what you managed to give us. And it's great to hear from one of our neighboring Caribbean territories as well. I should let everyone know that we did our best to find someone from Belize, and there are lots of people in Belize working on this area as well. But unfortunately, everyone is consumed with what is happening there in terms of their own coral bleaching events, etc. And so no one was available to be present today. But we are grateful for the wealth of information generated by these two presentations. And I do hope that everyone here has some comments, questions, anything. I know it was a lot to take in a short time. If there's anything you may want clarification on. I see there are a couple members of the media here. Maybe you want to ask some very specific targeted questions, but I don't mind kicking things off with a question on my end. And I'll start with you, Anjani. I did mention that I think it is important for us to return to this question of adaptation and restoration and exactly what that would look like. Because again, based on what we've received from both you and Valeria, there is a sense of us being in a pretty dark place where this is concerned. There's a kind of degree of inevitability that we're sensing as well from what you've described. So tell us a little bit about what adaptation and restoration would look like.
Thanks, Ardeen. So I think compared to Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago is at the beginning of learning in terms of applying strategies of resilience and restoration. And we are learning a lot from our peers, like in ABC Islands and Belize, on different strategies that we want to build capacity for in Tobago. With respect to climate change, we're looking at resilience type-based management, which is, resilience against the unknowns, right? So as Valeria explained, there are a lot of climate impacts that are happening as small island states to our marine ecosystems, but also on land. And so what we need to be able to do is have a framework where we can implement strategies based on the type of disturbances that we're experiencing, whether it is coral bleaching, whether it is severe storm damage, or even sea level rise. It's having a framework where we can, problem solve or work through solutions with the latest research and then applying it in a manner where we could prioritize sites depending on how we use different locations. So the IMA, we're actually starting a project where we did our pilot project last year, and we're actually in the first year of our main project over the next 5 years, which is the Marine Resilience Initiative. And there's 3 main pillars of focus. So the first one is building our capacity in resilience-based management, which is, one, looking at the current state of our limitations, looking at the challenges, working with THA on finding out, what is preventing us from, having active management systems and how can we improve. So it's a lot of network and building capacity in that way. And we do have regional partners with, for example, Secor International, who will help us work with along with strategies of restoration. So with respect to climate change, I know Valeria mentioned some of this, is that we want to build natural resilience in corals. So we're looking at strategies of restoration that will improve things like the genetic diversity of corals, and focus on corals that may be doing better. So being able to understand or do the research of the genetic variability that naturally exists in Tobago, focusing on those that might be more stress tolerant, and using those species to replenish sites that were degraded in the past. So there are a lot of things that we are looking into now, and like I said, we're right at the beginning.
Just out of curiosity, is the IMA in touch with the Perry Institute? I imagine you all must work together or collaborate in some way.
Not formally, only through Hannah, who works with both of us.
I was going to say we have a common person that used to be my intern, my technician, and now she's from Trinidad and Tobago, and now she works there. So yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, clearly collaboration is one of the keys, especially when we talk about the region. Even though we're diverse and different in so many ways, I feel like there's so much learning we can benefit from. I see here we have a question from Linda Straker. With regard to the Eastern Caribbean, what kind of damage has been done to the corals? Is there hope of recovery in the short term? What impact will damaged corals have on the tourism industry? And also, what kinds of actions can governments take? And this is for you, Valeria.
In the Eastern Caribbean. So, okay, I'm going to start like kind of Caribbean reefs. They have almost the same threats, right? In some levels, they're different. Like the Bahamas is huge. So you have places where are less inhabited. So overfishing is less of an issue than others, but in general, we have the same threats. So what you have in many reefs in the Western Caribbean are the same as in the Eastern Caribbean. We are looking, and it's a general thing in the Caribbean, we are looking at reef degradation starting at least since 1950. But we can do many, many things, right? We can have effective marine protected areas, we can manage our fisheries, we can reduce pollution, we can do coral restoration, and this can involve, and this is the most important one, you in every single solution, you have to involve community, social knowledge, but you have to involve as well industry and especially tourism. Like tourism, it's a key for our countries. We actually depend and live from tourism. So it's how we can reduce the tourism has an impact. I'm not gonna be like, they're not like the best, but they can be very, they can contribute so much if you know how to do it. So it's a matter of just how you approach your, let's say, coral restoration projects, how you involve the diving tourism on this. And you can involve diving tourism, you can involve cruises, you can involve so many people. And you can take actions from there. Anything that happens on corals will have an effect on anyone. And I know that it will affect at first the people that live in countries like ours, but it will affect everyone. Like the 20% of the diversity in the oceans comes from coral reefs. So any change of that will be like a snowball that will affect every single ecosystems. So everything is connected, and maybe it's something that what will impact the damage of corals on the tourism industry, everything is going to go down. And actions from government, well, they have the power at least to implement regulations of gas emissions. They can do much in a higher scales, higher levels that we cannot do. Like each one of us, we can buy hybrid cars, but we cannot control like most of the emissions. I don't know if Anjani has anything else to put. There's so many, it's so big, that question.
Thank you, Valeria. Anjani, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think Valeria is very thorough. I think in terms of individual action, we need to be more involved in the decision-making process. We need to put a lot of pressure and demand, from a lot more from the government that we do now with environmental focus, and just reinforcing what Valeria said. It's the impacts to us in our culture, our island way of life. It's severe and it is urgent. So it starts with all of us now.
I am curious if there are no more questions in the chat, and if there's no one with any hands up. I'm not seeing anyone, but please do let us know if someone in the meeting has a question or comment they'd like to make. I am curious about the amount of resources we're talking about here to do the work that is required. Does any of you have a sense of what we're looking at in terms of resources, and not just amount, not just the quantity, but what kinds of resources do we really need to mobilize here?
Well, I can start and then you can talk about so I think that one of the advantages that we have right now is the UN declared this decade as the ecosystem restoration decade, right? So there's many organizations say, okay, we're going to invest on this, and that is the kind of resources that we can apply now. And there are more calls, especially for coral restoration, that we can apply. But we need much more than that. Like some of the resources that I will say, like we need more education. We need people to understand what are corals, what are coral reefs, what is the synergy of coral reefs with us. So it comes all the resources besides like all the funding that we can get. We need education. We need more scientists. And I'm just gonna say, like, kind of in general, like, especially in the Caribbean, we need the governments to kind of work together because we are very linked. We are very connected all over the place. And sometimes politics doesn't allow to play a good role on how to connect everything.
Anjani?
I would learn that I think in terms of, apart from funding, so there's a lot of push for external funding to support and build capacity in marine management and restoration. But I think what is needed out of that is sustainable resources. So resources that comes from mandates through government so that it can allow for long-term management and consistent applied work, right, for the long term. A lot of our project fundings, they don't go beyond 5 years. You get 5 years if you're lucky, right? But remember, this is our future, and the future requires constant management, monitoring, and restoration, which then needs to be implemented within the government space, right, and policy space. With respect to marine research, I think we get definitely less than 1% of our economy, right, supports marine research. We definitely need more research and development, not just in conservation space, but in terms of other industries that can assist or make more sustainable use of our resources. With respect to like issues like, well, obviously, prevention is cheaper than curing. So restoration activities are known to be labor intensive and highly expensive. And of course, we want to be able to conserve and protect and be able to manage areas which would require a lot less resources. But as it is now, we need both in with respect to climate change, right? The other thing, so issues like fisheries management and land-based sources of pollution, which are the two big, like, chronic local stresses for Trinidad and Tobago, you need cross-sector collaboration. You need, we need to work with WASTA, we need to work with the Water Sewage Authority, we need to work with agriculture. So there needs to be a lot of coastal zone and watershed management that needs to happen, because whatever on land and upstream will affect our marine ecosystems. And that is the same for our fisheries management. And so we need resources in terms of education and understanding, the benefits of sustainable management. And it is, we just need more support all around, and more interest. And I think that's why education, especially of young people and children, are important. We want people to we don't want everybody to be marine biologists, right? We don't need that. We need people to be more environmentally conscious in whatever job they go into in the future. So if you're into if you're into engineering, we want you to have an understanding of your environment, your ecosystem, so that you can integrate that into your knowledge. And so you can have a future of, innovations that is aligned with things like climate change.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those responses. Solomon Meyer is asking, how can we identify potential sites of refuge for corals in the Caribbean? That is, sites where corals may be more protected from the effects of climate change in the coming years.
Yeah, there are a couple of sites that have already been identified. So especially during these bleaching events that we're having, like the one this year, it's happening in most of the Caribbean. And there are researchers, and well, we are like in the Bahamas, we're doing that. It's like seeing where are the areas where they're not bleaching, but as well, like if they're bleaching, they are recovering. So there are different sites, there are studies, there are some publications of reefs around the Caribbean that they are, they're acting as the, I just forgot the word, as the refugia, sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't help you, Valeria. It's actually quite embarrassing as English speakers living so near to Venezuela. Yes, Anjani?
Yeah, so we, in terms of Tobago and the work we're doing in Tobago, we are, again, learning from a lot of the research that was conducted at a regional level. So there's certain things cues that we look for as Valeria mentioned. So reefs that may not have bleached as severely, reefs that have survived. We look at the risk as well. So when I showed you the vulnerability map, there were areas that had lower projections, right? So therefore lower risk to be seen whether, you know, that actually follows through. So, but we can plan for areas that can serve as refuge. In Charlottesville, one of the sites are relatively healthier compared to other sites, and it has a lower risk. So we could try and see, you know, maybe we should protect that area in Charlottesville, so that we can actually make it even more resilient and maybe act as a host site to serve for restoration or a source site. So those are the strategies that we are working out within the reefs of our areas.
Simone Gampat is saying, considering the fact that oceans are expected to continue warming, can either of you please speak to the current state or potentiality of other approaches besides restoration? For example, hybrid solutions like artificial reefs, etc., that are now being taken into account here in the Caribbean.
You want to start?
Yeah, I could start. So there are different types. So what you've listed, there are different types of restoration, and those different strategies depends on the disturbance, right? So when you think of artificial reefs or hybrid reefs, you generally use those strategies in areas where the structure cannot come back. So like physical damages from storms, right? So there's one thing where we have different types of restoration strategies that we can do to counter different disturbance events, right? When it comes to bleaching and the different types of species, you could do type of strategies like coral farming of very, you know, fast growing branching corals to bring the structure back quickly so that corals can have that habitat. When you think of slow growing species, or when you think of your goal of you want a more resilient reef, you focus on larval propagation strategies, right? So restoration is one thing. The restoration sits within a framework of management, right? And that is really a struggle for a lot of places, right? So you cannot do restoration on your own. You must also have a framework where you have an authority and you have regulations of different activities on the reef. So for example, one thing that we're trying to focus on is protection of grazers or herbivores on the reef, right? So when corals die, what replaces corals very quickly are the fast-growing algae on the reefs. And one way to facilitate rapid recovery is having a fish population that can graze readily on the reef and remove the algae so you have clean surfaces for corals to regrow. So you want to manage the catching of parrotfish, for example, the catching of crab species that graze on the reef. The other thing, as I mentioned, is land-based sources of pollution. So you want to regulate the activities that are happening on land adjacent to the reefs. If you're going to have a port next to a reef, or you have a river, or you have a lot of land clearing, those reefs are more at risk of being degraded and being impacted by sedimentation on top of the fact that there's climate change. So there's definitely a whole slew of management practices that can be implemented. And as I said, restoration is just one of those tools that would help.
Thank you, Anthony. Valeria?
Yeah, I will just clarify, when we talk about restoration, and especially in this context, we are talking about ecological restoration, but restoration has, as Anthony said, that non-direct actions that can be like regulations, politics, marine protected areas, fisheries management. So when we talk, and that is one thing that confuses everyone, when we talk about restoration, it's such a broad concept. When we're talking about having coral nurseries or doing larval propagation, that is ecological restoration. So there are many, many ways. The only thing is when we are working on try to conserve, preserve, restore, rehabilitate, we need to think that all these ecosystems are living systems. So when you replace any of these ecosystems with structures that are not living, that will last just a couple of years, I'm going to say, And you have to know about the dynamics of the sediments, the water movements, so many things that we don't understand very well. So not everything functions. If you want to put like a wall, a reef ball, so anything, just think that all of what we're talking about are living systems.
Thank you for that. And I want to point out some potential funding options that Joella Rambaran has shared with everyone here. Number one, blue bonds, debt for marine swaps similar to Belize, and donor funding for blue economy activities related to coral reef resilience. I imagine some of these, if not all of them, have already crossed your path. So, you know, I mean, in the case of an institute like yours, Valeria, I'm sure that you'll depend on donor funding. So I'm sure that you're familiar with these, but what about blue bonds in particular? Is that something, Anjani, in your case, that features as a real option?
I'm gonna say,
I would say I don't know much about blue bonds, so I'm just gonna flat out be honest. I know that the institute is working on blue economy strategies. Not me personally, but we're basically building our capacity in the understanding of it and how it can be applied to the ecosystems of Tobago. But I could personally say that I'm not familiar with the ins and outs. And I've heard that there are some benefits, and I know they apply it a lot in Mexico, being that case study. So I'll have to refer to Valeria on that one.
Yeah, the main thing with blue bonds is it's something that is growing, and it's growing really fast, and especially in the Caribbean. I'm gonna say that coral reefs are not the best for blue bonds. Like seagrass beds and mangroves, they're great because of like carbon storage and everything that is related with that. Yeah, the corals and coral reefs, they do it, but they do it in evolution times, and they're not as effective as seagrass bed and mangroves. So most of the countries, and we are collaborating with other partners, and especially the government has this, is based on mangroves and seagrass beds for us.
Okay. And we have another question here from Simone as we get ready to wrap up. She's asking, Anjani, can you give any insight on the stakeholder engagement strategies that have taken place in TNT with respect to reefs, and what has or hasn't worked, or what lessons have you learned?
Thanks. That's an activity that we're actually going through right now. So I'd say that a lot of our stakeholder engagements are a lot of it is based in Tobago. So we have a lot of in-person workshops. The distance between Trinidad and Tobago may not be great, but it is a challenge as our institution is based in Trinidad. So we work with a lot of stakeholders in Tobago, and we try and sort of get people involved, not just at the workshops or the meetings, but we do try and encourage volunteers to come diving with us. We do try, with the seagrass component of the Marine Resilience Initiative, we try and engage with not just the stakeholders that work in the marine environment, but also public sector and private sector businesses. And some of them, like the tourism associations, they've been involved. So it is getting better. We're trying to be more, sophisticated in terms of like social media outreach and whatnot. And it is something that we are learning. And I won't say that it is working at the optimum level, but it's something that we are definitely trying to reach out to get better, relationships with.
Valerie, it would be interesting to hear what your experience has been with stakeholder engagement in the Bahamas, and whether there may be some lessons you can share. But I do see Arthur Potts' hand raised. So Arthur, maybe you want to ask your question directly to the presenters. You can turn your mic on.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Adine. And very happy to see you. Listen to you a lot on 95. All right. Now, I just have a simple question, very much in line with the one that you just read. For many years, the Institute of Marine Affairs has been involved with managing seagrass beds, mangroves, and coral reef centers. And at different times, different IMA directors have taken different approaches to running things. I remember there was a time when a lady called Hazel McShine worked very closely with the Director of Marine Resources and Fisheries in Tobago and worked closely with the coral reef specialists and the mangrove specialists and so on, ensure that work being done in the region. And they used to call it a Cari-Comp program, which involved people working on Bahamas and Colombia, just to bring in Valeria in this. In fact, I actually remember some of those names. And it was a regional approach to treating with those things. That project has probably since come to an end. But what I'm worried about now is, within recent times, I'm not sure what the state of the coral reef environment is in Tobago, not just Booker Reef, but as Anjani was showing in the picture, they have Flying Reef, Culloden Reef, Reef all the way in Speyside and so on. What is the present state of those reefs, and what is the relationship of the IMA with the main government stakeholder, the Department of Marine Resources, to ensure that we understand the state of the reefs and we do work in terms of managing those reefs, even in the environment where we're dealing with level rise and increased temperatures and so on. That's just my approach to it.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Anjani?
Thanks, Dr. Potts. Yeah, so the Cari-Comp there's certain elements of Cari-Comp that continues to this day. It's not in terms of, I think, with respect to coral reefs, it has been sort of advanced in terms of methodologies. So we use a similar method for assessing like benthic composition for reef health, but we also include additional measures of reef resilience, such as like the herbivore biomass. We periodically look at the structural complexity of reefs, and we do assess. We are trying to put out a reef resilience index similar to Bahamas and Belize's report cards. We have done drafts of these which have been approved. It has to go to publication, and then we can sort of release this to the public. So that is in the pipeline, where we urgently need more accessible information, and those reef report cards seem to be doing very well around the Caribbean. I think with stakeholders having that access, it is definitely more visible, and with those infographics. So that is something that we are continuing to work with. We do work very closely with the Department of Resources and Fisheries. They are partners with us on the Marine Resilience Initiative. We do have divers that work out, and we do try and connect with them, but they are struggles in terms of being able to, which is mostly with the pace and trying to get change implemented, right? So we do work with THA, and we do involve them as much as we can in different levels of stakeholder engagement, as well as with information sharing and whatnot. So we have, for example, the Marine Data Hub, where we are trying to make publicly available all our biodiversity data, but also have people to sort of view what data we have from IME that can be shared with NGOs and our government partners. So there's a lot that we're trying to do, but it is a slow process. And
thanks, Anjani. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anjani. We are basically at the end with 1 minute left, but I think it would be good for each of you, Valeria and Anjani, to just leave our audience members with some kind of call to action. You know, the thing about these kinds of issues, I know they often feel very overwhelming for ordinary citizens, because you wonder, well, what can I do? I mean, Anjani, you've spoken clearly about the issue of fisheries, settling that, and the contribution of land development, land-based development, and how our activities here affect what happens in the ocean. But if there are specific calls to action you can make to those here and folks who will eventually see this, that would be ideal.
I think, I mean, there's simple actions. So obviously, you know, I think people need to be able to be open to learn more about the reefs in their backyards. Go snorkeling, go diving, learn to swim, get out there and just to see how much of our marine environments are very precious to us. In terms of call to action, that we need to do more advocacy for our island ecosystems, right? So we need to be involved in, we need to get the government more involved in having that dialogue. We don't hear about climate change. We don't hear about our natural resources, as opposed, you know, with respect to our, you know, forests and our reserves, our watershed management. Those dialogues are very, would have the repercussions of climate change are very severe for small island states, and we need to push for more discussion, more action. So where we can, you know, if we could ever get a minister or attention of government officials, we need to put pressure on them to start talking about it and then start acting on it. But in the meantime, connect with IME, connect with NGOs, see if you can volunteer, see if you can help out some way, you know.
You are muted.
Right. Over to you, Valeria.
So it's in the same lines, and I think I said it, but I don't remember this exact quote, but it's like, if you know something, you will care about it, right? So for me, it's like, if you know about corals, if you know about an ecosystem, if you know about something, just spread the word. Like, let people know, engage people on learning the importance, why we depend on corals, why we depend on fish, why we depend on ecosystems, and maybe we can do things to change just because we care. It's spreading, educating. For me, it will be like the key, and then we're gonna start all the others. I agree, like, go to your local NGOs and see how can you volunteer, see where they have like clean events that you have, like in the reef, even diving or snorkeling, like all these different small things. But if you learn and if you teach, like if you go and you talk to your neighbor, to your friend, to your grandparent, just like kind of, hey, did you know that corals are animals? That starts like a very small sand grain, but that could grow and grow and grow.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And I appreciate that you both emphasize that in your presentations as well. And I think one thing people can definitely do is continue to join us here at the Cropper Foundation and Cari-Bois for our webinars, where you get a lot of information from the experts themselves, the folks on the ground, and, well, in this case, in the water, finding out everything that we don't know and take for granted and bringing it to us here on a day like today. So thank you both, Valeria and Anjani, for taking the time and for making the effort to share all that you know with us. And hopefully it's something we can follow up, especially as we see how the coral bleaching progresses in the region. This being a major event, we'll see what happens into next year, and maybe we'll have some follow-up with both of you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you to all of you who joined us, who spent your lunch hour and more with us, for your questions, your interest. Thanks for staying with us. And we'll be back with another webinar near the end of the month, so do look out for that. Take care. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Okay, bye.